Thanks for joining us today at Breakthrough Leadership. Remember, Breakthrough Leadership, we're here to help you unlock your purpose, live with passion, and become the leader you were created to be. I'm so excited to have today Gary Moore here to talk with you about creativity in leadership. You're not going to want to miss this conversation, and I'm excited. My name is Greg Yates, and I'm glad for you to join us today as we discuss creativity in leadership. Gary, you're going to have to put up with some of my antics on this thing, because I get excited about talking with you. I mean, when we talk, it's like I'm not sure who really gets a chance to say the most, but if you don't know Gary, I mean, just let me tell you just a couple of things about Gary. I mean, you should be excited and paying attention to this conversation, because Gary has been where you are. You know, Gary started out in leadership. Just correct me if I say anything wrong here, Gary, but he was kind of an unwilling leader at first. He had a degree in music, and he's a fantastic musician, and was thrust into some leadership roles that he really didn't intend, and found out that God had equipped him to be a leader, and that he had the skills and everything necessary to energize teams for a specific purpose. Some of you watching may actually be in that exact same situation, where you're finding yourself in a role and you're saying, how do I surround myself with people who can help me become the leader I was created to be? Well, that's part of why we're having this conversation today. You know, Gary has led several successful companies. He was the CEO of a major corporation that was publicly traded, internationally known. I mean, we could go into so many discussions about various topics, and I'm sure that this won't be the last time that we dig into some topics that Gary's involved in. But Gary's also become a best-selling author, and if you haven't heard of these titles and you want to read something that's really inspirational, has incredible passion involved in it, you need to read a few titles that are written by Gary. I mean, hundreds of thousands of copies have been sold of Playing with the Enemy. Your latest book, The Final Service, my personal inspirational favorite. Really enjoy that book. And then Hey Buddy, which I admit I haven't read,
well,
but
go ahead.
He'll wait, okay. But some great titles that if you haven't read from Gary, I know after you hear this interview, you're going to want to get his take on some of these other things. An amazingly creative guy, and that's why I wanted to discuss today a topic about creativity in leadership. Thanks for coming today, Gary. Any opening comments before I send you down this rabbit hole?
No, I'm excited to be here. So it's so shoot away. We're ready.
Well, you know, what's the real challenge? I mean, becoming the leader that we're created to be has a lot of challenges, but when you talk about creativity, I'm just going to relay what I consider to be the greatest challenge that I ever faced as a leader. You know, when you start out in a company and you've got this small, intimate group of people, well, it's easy for everybody to know your heart and to hear your vision and to see all those things just kind of unfolding. You know, you're on the same page a lot more easily. But as a company grows, it's hard to let all those voices come back, right? And my challenge was this. I really found that in growing organizations, I struggled out there to filter the voices that would want to penetrate and influence me in my decision making. But the problem is that over time, most leaders want the overall workforce to just let the creativity flow from the top down. You know, we want that to come from us, and we expect the workforce at some level to begin just falling in line. Now we've got all these resources out there that we're not pulling creativity from, and I'm speaking for me, I got this mistaken identity or this mistaken impression that somehow I was the one who was empowered to be creative, nobody else, just me. Mm-hmm. And I was supposed to solve these problems. And after a while, everybody just sat back and sort of let me, right? And it was so I want to get your take on this, because, I just don't think it's a problem that only exists with a few people. I think this is a common, monstrous leadership issue. What's your experience?
Well, I agree with you. It's I think one of the greatest challenges in leading a team, leading an organization, is making sure that the only voice you're hearing isn't your own. Yeah. It's I see it more than I don't. leaders who believe their job is to give instructions, to give information, and not receive information back. And some of the greatest leaders that I've ever met listen much more than they speak. You know, they accumulate the information from the people who are actually on the ground, people in the field doing the job, and then make decisions based on it, not based upon their orders to them to go do things a certain way, which is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
Because I don't care how smart you are, I don't care how good you are, if you're not actually on the ground doing what they're doing, you never experience what they experience. And so the instructions you give often aren't really credible.
Yeah, I mean, do you feel like, is it, maybe it's just me because I'm mega type A, yeah, but don't you feel like a lot of times leaders, even new leaders, feel that because they're in that role, people are looking to them to have those answers? And that if they don't, somehow it degrades them or it doesn't show their leadership. So they're out there trying to prove they're leaders when leadership may be counterintuitive as much as anything.
Sure. And you're right. I think that I think about my younger years in leadership. I had to have the answers. Fortunately, I had some mentors in my life who would tell me, hey, sit back and more often ask questions, put a question mark at the end of your statements rather than a period. And he said, you can get some incredible information from your team. And yes, you're the ultimate decider. You have to make the decisions. The responsibility rests on your shoulders. But make those decisions based on what you're hearing from the field.
Yeah. Well, so how do you filter that? I mean, there still has to be filters though, right? I mean, eventually, say you've got 100 people feeding back and a limited time frame. And of course, even if the mission is clear, you're going to have all these variances. How do you do justice to making sure that the right voices actually get heard?
Well, that's discernment, and I think that comes from prayer.
Yeah.
I really do. You know, in my later years in leadership, I spent a lot of time in prayer, asking to hear the right voices, asking God to speak to me about what I should be hearing. But the other thing is when you talk about hearing hundreds of voices, I don't think that it's possible to really take in that much information and make good decisions. Jack, oh gosh, I can't think of Jack's last name, was head of General Electric for years. Jack Welch for years. He said that even the best and the brightest leaders can only listen to 5 voices. And he said you have 5 people who are leading your 5 divisions or 5 groups, and they have to listen to their 5, who has to listen to their 5. Other leaders will tell you that that creates a hierarchical organization that's too deep, and you need to flatten it out. But even flatten it out, if you're hearing more than 5 voices on a regular basis, and if you feel you can't trust those voices, then you're going to have a problem.
That's huge. Yeah. That's big. That's big stuff, Gary. I mean, how do you really feel? Just to kind of take this a slightly different slant. Okay. I've kind of had this. This sense as a leader that one of the things I didn't do as well as I should have done was to mentor other leaders. In other words, I've got this close group of 5 people, but ultimately I want those 5 people to be strong leaders as well, right?
Absolutely. The mark of any great leader, I think, in any great organization is once that leader leaves, the organization continues without them.
That's scary.
Well, yeah. Anytime that the leader leaves and the organization collapses, it really wasn't a team. The whole thing was built on that one person.
Yeah. So we're kind of accepting or promoting this idea that for a leader to truly be a leader, he's got to develop other leaders.
Absolutely.
Right. So now this idea of creativity, it must be seeded down into these other leaders, right? I mean, we're thinking that the seed of creativity comes from us, for example. Maybe we're the entrepreneur. We're the person who had this brilliant idea, who went through things that other people weren't willing to go through. And then now they're there, and it's difficult sometimes to feel like we're on equal footing and they ought to have all this input. But if we're really leaders, is it a fair assumption to say that we should be planting that creativity seed in them? I mean, how can they become who they were supposed to be if they're not creative?
I think that's a tough one. We all have different gifts. And so the people we work with, some of them are naturally creative, some aren't. Some are people who are incredibly focused. And they're very, very good at details. Oftentimes, the most creative leaders not that great with details.
You're right.
Which certainly describes me. And so I don't think that we can expect and have the idea that we can kind of implant creative leadership in each one of those people. We really have to be, prayerful and discerning about their gifts and then expanding on their gifts. Where you need a leader with creativity, put a creative leader there. Where you need a detailed leader, a person who has great organizational skills, put that there. And sometimes, quite often, they're different people.
That's beautiful. I mean, that's beautiful. So what happens now when you've got a person in a creative role? I mean, in a role that's problem solving, which problem solving often, right, requires a degree of creativity.
Sure.
I mean, it's not always just a pre-programmed sequence of things that we can, mandate into our policies and procedures. Sometimes creativity has to overlay those things and kind of become the electricity that makes policies and procedures come alive to solve problems. I mean, if we could solve every problem with a policy or procedure, well, it'd be a pretty boring existence. But we try. I did as leader. If that ever happens again, here's what we'll do. What do you think about that? I mean, I know this varies too, but I've always been afraid that in doing that, what I did was eliminate further discussion, further development of creative solutions. I just carved those things off and said, we don't go there anymore.
Yeah, and I think that it goes back to, again, saying you can say the same things, but when you put a period at the end of it, it comes across as, this is your instructions, this is your mission. When you put a question at the end of it, it encourages people to get feedback. There's a book, it's been out for 30 years, but it's one of my favorite all-time books called Whack on the Side of the Head. You know the book.
I talked about it not very long ago.
Yeah. Well, I used to, when I would go into a leadership position, the first thing I would do is I would pass out that book to everyone. And just like if you're running a sports team, they're going to work out. They're going to do their calisthenics. They're going to eat right, so on and so forth. We used to begin our meetings with questions out of Whack at the Side of the Head. And what it would do is it would start with a question, a silly question usually. What happens if blacktop came in red and blue, or different colors? And the team could only respond with a question. And so you ask a question that doesn't really make much sense. They have to respond with a question, and the questions keep going back and forth until you come to a creative answer. And I think that some people are born with a great deal of creativity. Some people develop it. But you develop that creativity by asking questions, making them answer with questions, and the questions go back and forth all of a sudden, and somebody will say, wow, that's really cool.
It's like I tell Matt all the time, some of my greatest ideas have been accidental. In fact, most of them.
Oh.
Yeah, that's
well, Thomas Edison said that exact same thing.
Oh, really? Well, hey, I'm in good company, I guess.
Absolutely.
I guess where I want to be careful not to change topics, because boy, I could really explore this topic. Maybe we can do this another time. But the idea of when we choose to kind of put the ingredients of creativity, really bring them to bear. I mean, where I've struggled and seen other leaders struggle is you've got a time crunch, and you've got history, and we begin just making all these rash assumptions that we don't do it this way because of that. This caused us some grief, so we just carve that out. And the path gets narrower and narrower and narrower that we're supposed to walk, that supposedly is going to take us to our success that we've identified. But creativity is what allows us to expand the path, my view. And I'm concerned about, what would you tell a leader who would say, oh yeah, we tried that, it didn't work, we carved it off, rather than, okay, it's time for us together as a team to apply creativity. I love your emphasis on prayer, but to apply creativity to this topic to see if we can't broaden the path a little bit.
I don't know how many times I've heard somebody say what you just said. We tried that and it doesn't work.
Yeah, I hate that.
Okay, well, all right, okay, you tried it, it doesn't work. I think one of the essential truths you have to kind of embed in your organization is that there's more than one right answer.
Beautiful.
There are plenty of right answers. What happens is we're taught in school to come up with the right answer. And it really kills creativity, during exercises of creativity, I'll ask people a lot of times, give me 10 answers to this question. They say, well, would you want the best one? I said, we don't know what the best one is. Give me 10.
That's beautiful. I
Give me
love
10.
that.
And you come up with 10
I
different,
love
10
that.
different answers.
I hope somebody's writing that down.
And what it does, it forces people to think beyond this.
Yeah.
How do you drink water? Out of a cup. Well, how else can you drink water?
Yeah.
Out of a glass. How else can you?
That is beautiful.
Put your head under the faucet. I mean, there's just, give me 10 ways. And it forces people to kind of think outside of the box and think differently. Because we're used to, most people, not you, but most people are used to finding this single one right answer.
Yeah.
And if that doesn't work, they're lost. They're dead.
That's beautiful. Well, I hope you've really enjoyed stirring your mind up with a few of these questions and topics. And if you've got comments, man, I hope you'll just list them below where we're asking for your comments. Ask questions. I'll get Gary to participate in trying to answer some of those questions. But I hope you're as excited as we are about applying creativity in leadership, especially Christian leadership. And we're going to be back and talk in another section here about another topic as it specifically relates to Christian creativity and Christian leadership. And that's my discussion with you, Gary. You can get ready now in the next 5 minutes. My discussion with you about God's place in creating us as creative beings. I mean, is there a sense that God created us to be creative? I really want to talk about that, and we'll look forward to seeing you in part B of this Breakthrough Leadership video.